One of the questions the students usually have has to do with the types of money the Romans had access to. They're used to things like pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, and when they read translations of characters purchasing things, they just like to get an idea of the kinds of coins Romans would have used, the kind of money that changed hands, sizes, denominations, and so forth. So what could you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, we'll just follow on from your introduction with pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters. We'll start with the smallest Roman coin, which is a quadrans. It's made out of bronze, which is a combination of copper and tin. 2 quadrantes gives you a semis, which is also made out of copper. 2 semises gives you an ass, I should say. That is also made out of copper. 2 asses gives you a dupondius. Now the dupondius, you can see, has a brass color, and it's actually made out of brass. That is copper and zinc. 2 dupondii give you a sestertius. And as you can see, that's pretty big. And that's the standard coin that is used when talking, for the most part, when talking about prices in the late Republic and the early Empire. So when Cicero bought a new house, he talked about the fact that it cost 3.5 million sestertii. Rather than using a higher value coin like a denarius, there are 4 sestertii to the denarius. And the denarius, you can see, is small. It's like a dime. It's made of silver. And the big one, the one that virtually nobody except people like Cicero saw, is the aureus, which is made of gold. And there are 25 denarii to the aureus. And an aureus is struck at 60 to the pound. They don't worry about whether the individual coin is exactly right. They just take a pound, they break it up into 60 parts. So some of them are a little bigger, some of them are a little smaller, but it all works out in the end. And that's generally there. Those are the 7 kinds of coins that you have in the late Republic and the early Empire.
Excellent. So one of the questions students often have when they're looking at translations and stories and understanding Roman life is how much things would have cost. So things around them in their daily life, what would the Romans have paid for them in terms of the coins that you've just told us about?
That's probably the most difficult question to answer of any of the questions that you have.
Yeah.
There are a lot of problems involved. First of all, the Roman Empire existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, so the prices of something for instance, in the late Republic, are going to be quite different from the prices in the 3rd century. So first of all, you have to be comparing apples and apples, as it were. You can't just say a sestertius is worth $5 and apply it to any kind of price that you have, regardless of the date of the document. The other thing is that there was a great difference in the Roman world and the prices between things that you could simply pull out of the ground, like vegetables or whatever else, or things you could hunt or fish or whatnot, that really didn't involve sort of personal involvement an awful lot. And then on the other hand, things that were manufactured. Anything that was manufactured, or there's any kind of intense industry involved in it, even something like a loaf of bread, you actually have to grind the grain and you have to make the bread. With wine, you've got to be able to crush the grapes and you've got to have somewhere in order to keep them. But in particular, when you're talking about something like clothing, where you not only have to manufacture the cloth, and then you have to make the clothes themselves. Most people did it at home simply because clothing was too expensive. So there's going to be a really big gap in the prices in comparison to modern prices between those 2 kinds of commodities. The other thing is that even if you now, when you visit other countries, you go into a grocery store, or you go into a market or whatever, and you'll see things that are a lot cheaper than they are in Canada, and you'll also go and look at something else and realize that that's a lot more expensive. So even in other countries, there isn't a kind of linear comparison between, say, soap and meat or whatever, where you can simply say that that's the value of it. And that's what you run into in the Roman world in particular. The other thing that you run into, again, it depends on what you're talking about, whether you're talking about bread, whether you're talking about fish, or whether something like wages. Roman wages are going to be very, very low in relation to what we would think you would need to live on. And as a result, if you have the price for rents, for instance, or what somebody would make, or how much somebody was paid, or whatever, those numbers are going to seem much lower than anything in the Roman world. So the problem is it becomes very, very difficult. Everything ends up being in its own little category, where you have to say that, well, in this category, Sestertius is worth so much, in this category, Sestertius is worth something else. So unfortunately, you really can't have simply a simple number, a Sestertius equals X number of dollars, and then expect to be able to plug it in for any number anywhere.
Exactly. It changes over time. It changes from place to place. So a good idea.
Well, location, that's another, I hadn't,
Absolutely.
yes, it's another one that I had forgotten about. There's a
Yeah.
perfect example of St. Augustine. St. Augustine came from North Africa, where they, one of the major crops was olive oil. When he went to Milan in northern Italy, he couldn't understand why people didn't use olive oil in their lamps.
Yeah.
Oh, it was because it was too expensive. Everybody in Africa has olive oil coming out their ears,
Yeah.
practically,
Yeah.
so they can use it for anything. But in northern Italy, unfortunately, in order to ship it all the way from Carthage to Rome and then to Milan, it just became so expensive that there's no way you could just stick it in the lamp and burn it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
again, in the same way, when we go to another country to look at other things, even in the Roman world, depending on where you were in the Roman world, that would affect the price as well. So that's an excellent point.
Yeah, yeah. So coins have various words associated with the structures on them that students might not be familiar with. So for example, a coin has an obverse and a reverse, and they're minted in a very particular way. So could you tell us anything about the way a coin was created in the ancient world and what was used on each side?
Sure, not a problem. Coins are actually, ancient coins are exactly the same as modern coins. As you say, there is the heads, which is the obverse, which is the front of the coin, and the tails, which the Romans called ships when they flipped their coins, which is the back of the coin. So for us, that's kind of odd, because you tend to think of the front of a coin as being the beaver or the ship or the caribou or whatever, and the queen's head being the backside. But in fact, queen's head is the front, and that's the obverse. And it's actually a technical distinction. The obverse is the die, which is what you use to make a coin, is what goes in the anvil, which is the big chunk of metal that you use when you strike coins. So the obverse goes into the anvil, and then the reverse die is put into a punch. And that's basically the distinction. Whatever goes into the anvil is the obverse, whatever goes into the punch is the reverse. And so for the Romans, what happens is you have probably fairly small rooms, which are horribly hot, horribly smoky, horribly awful and noisy. There's a fire going, there are a whole bunch of slaves, and they have produced the blanks for these coins beforehand. They heat them up so that they're soft. You'll have one guy who'll drop the hot metal onto the spot on where the die is, the obverse die is in the anvil. The other one will put the punch over top of it, and then a third slave will whack that punch twice. And we know that it's twice because we have lots and lots of examples where that coin shifts a little bit in between. And we can see that there are only ever 2 strikes on the coin when that happens. It's called a double strike. And so those are the technical terms for that. And then you just have somebody basically who pops it off, and then the next one comes down, and it's just probably 15, 20 hours a day, no doubt. Room just filled with these people hammering all the time.
Excellent. Now, when they would do the punches and create the images on the coins, are there any kinds of inscriptions or wording that we see? It's usually condensed, of course, but what would we see regularly on a coin that we could look at as a student looking at a coin? You could kind of read the information from the coin and try to figure out what that coin is telling us about the ancient world.
Sure. Well, the first thing is that the main point of the coin is that it has the emperor's portrait and his titles, his name. And that is what gives the coinage its authority. That proves that it's supposed to prove, because of course there were counterfeits in the ancient world, just the same as there are in the modern world. But the basic idea is that proves the value of the coin. It has the emperor's name and picture on it. So the obverse is almost always going to have a picture of the emperor or the empress, whoever it is that is the coin is being struck for, and then it will have that person's name and titles, usually starting in the bottom left-hand corner and going clockwise around. Sometimes they go the other way. Those are what are known as retrograde inscriptions, but those are very rare. You don't have to worry about those. So normally the emperor's name is going to be in full, and that's well, again, depends whether it's the nomen or the cognomen that he's known for, but that'll be in full. But other parts of his name will be abbreviated, and his titles will very often be abbreviated. So if you look at the standard title, let's say for Trajan, so you would have Imperator Caesar Trajanus Augustus.
Right.
Okay, and so what you'll have is for Imperator, you'll just have Imp, I-M-P.
Right.
And for Kaiser, you'll just have Kais, C-A-E-S. Then his name, Trajanus, and then usually Aug, A-U-G, for Augustus. If you have more than one Augustus, what you do is you double the G at the end. So if you had, for instance, a legend referring to two Augusti, okay, so let's say Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus or something, you would have A-U-G-G for two of them. Sometimes you'll also have other aspects of their titles as well. It might be Germanicus Maximus or whatever the case may be. You might have tribunician power. You might have a consulship that's mentioned. Sometimes the emperors have huge. The titles themselves are really long and complicated,
Right.
and you can have some of those on the obverse. Sometimes those will switch over to the reverse, or if you have particular titles, like for instance, Trajan is known as Optimus Princeps. An emperor might be known as Pater Patriae,
Right.
and so these things will also go on the reverse as well, as along with the renewals of tribunician power, which took place in December of every year. So in a way, that kind of marks his regnal years in a sense. So you'll have something like Trib Pot, or just TR Pot for Tribunicia Potestata in the ablative, and then the number, how many times it's been renewed, how many times he's been consul. So you have COS for Cos, and then you'll have a number after telling you how many times he's been consul. Or you might even have Cos Desig for Consul Designatus. So when he's been elected, this will be in the second half of the year after you don't have elections, unfortunately, anymore for consul. The emperor appoints himself, but it still happens at the beginning of July. And in the second half of the year, he might be Cos and then have a 4, and then he might be Cos Desig 5, designate consul
Right.
for the 5th time. So you can have all sorts of things like that that will can appear on the obverse, but can also spill over into the legend that you get on the reverse. The reverse itself can have pretty much anything you
Right.
want it,
Right.
really. In a sense, it's a very complicated problem, and scholars actually argue about it a lot. But in general, it looks as though it is the reverse of the coin is used by the emperor to basically send a message to the people. Often you'll hear it referred to as propaganda. Trouble is, nowadays when we hear about propaganda, we tend to think of the Nazis and Soviet Russia and those kinds of things. This is more sort of PR or spin, I guess, in a way. The way the emperor wants you to think about him and the empire. So you'll have things like imperial victories. So you probably have heard of the Judea Capta coins or the Egypto Capta coins that have the crocodile chained to the palm tree. You can have the emperor's family, for instance. Augustus had coins with Livia on the reverse. You can have imperial virtues, the kinds of things that the emperor wants to be known for, that he's particularly generous or whatever. So you'll have the goddess Liberalitas, for instance, or you might have Fortuna Augusta. You could have Felicitas, who wants everybody to be happy. You can have those sorts of things. Very often you'll have imperial building projects. That's very common. So you'll have temples. We have coins with the Colosseum on them. We have coins with the Circus Maximus on them. So really there's almost no limit to the different kinds of things that you can find in the reverses of coins. And that's one of the things that interests people a lot. And what happens in the 3rd century in particular, which is kind of interesting, is that you very often get again, as I say, what the emperor, the message that the emperor wants to convey to the people. And consequently, very often in the 3rd century, where we have lots of usurpers and emperors are getting killed all the time by the army, more often than not, you'll have a picture of, or a device, technically is the technical term for it, the device, is the emperor shaking hands with the soldier, and it'll say something like Concordia Militum, concord of the soldiers, on the reverse, when in fact there is no Concordia Militum.
And the other thing that I've often found students over time looking at coinage being careful of, from the bottom left is where you start to read the inscription, but sometimes the image will be a little high on the coin, so the inscription...
Or it'll be worn.
Or it'll be worn,
exactly,
yeah. So
yes.
sometimes the inscription will start on the left and then skip over where the head is and continue on the right, so it's not necessarily a complete word.
That's right.
You may have a condensed word, you don't have punctuation to tell you that's the end of that.
That's the real problem, unfortunately. Yeah, you can learn all the Latin you want, but then you look at a coin and you find that the coin is just filled with abbreviations. It's the same thing with inscriptions.
Right.
And you have exactly the same problems. There are no spaces between the words, there's no punctuation, and you have all of these abbreviations all over the place. And unless you know what the abbreviations are, you're not going to be able to work out what's going on. So if you look on the reverse of a bronze coin, any bronze coin that you look at, on the reverse somewhere, you're going to have the letters SC. Doesn't matter what Latin you know, you're never going to figure out what that means unless you know what the abbreviation is to start with.
Right.
It's kind of like Tacitus. You can't translate him unless you know what he says. So SC stands for ex senatus consulto. That is, by decree of the Senate. The Senate controlled the minting of the bronze coins. The emperor controlled the minting of the silver and the gold. So it's always stated on the bronze coins that the Senate is responsible for their control, and that's what the SC stands for.
Excellent. And then the other thing sometimes you find on the reverse is an indication of where the coin was minted. Like there might be an image that's particular to Ephesus, or that identifies, like you're mentioning, the conquest of Egypt being represented by the crocodile. So sometimes you have iconography or imagery, animals, statues that link a coin to a particular part of the empire, whether it was minted there or meant to commemorate something that happened there. And that's often what you'll find on the reverse, so you should flip it over and take a look for that.
That's
as well.
true. That's part of what's being said. Often as far as location is concerned, this isn't true really in the first 3 centuries. It's really only towards the end of the 3rd century, and then from the 4th century onward, you have mint marks.
Right.
And those will be at the bottom of the reverse in a little area called the exurg, which is separate from the rest of the device, the picture that's on there. And that will give you the name of the mint, where the coin was struck. Very often it'll give you the officina as well. Very often, especially when you have a big mint, they'll be divided up into different officinae. So you'll have A, B, C, D. They usually tend to go by letters of the alphabet. And so you'll be able to tell what, not only what mint it was, so what city I should say the coin was minted in, but could also tell you what the actual officina was. Trouble is, we really don't know how they were set up, and whether the officinae were all together, or whether the officina is really the same room. It's just at a different time. You know, in January it's A, and in February it's B. We have absolutely no idea.
Right. One of the things in Canada that's just happened is we've stopped using the penny. That's no longer in circulation. And I think students would find it really interesting to understand that in ancient Rome, there were times when different currencies that you just showed us were no longer used as inflation happened and as the value of different metals changed. The coinage also changed. So what can you tell us about coins that stopped being used at different parts of time, just like our penny is now no longer in circulation?
Well, exactly the same thing happened to the Romans. The Romans had inflation, the same as we do. It wasn't nearly as bad as ours in the first half of the empire. But in general, the coins were worth whatever the government said they were worth, and people accepted that. But as time went on, again, because there's a bit of inflation, the little quadrands disappeared. People didn't need it anymore. For instance, in Britain, they used to have a halfpenny, a half penny. That disappeared in the 1980s. then the semis disappeared, then the as disappeared. As you go along slowly again, as the coinage becomes worth less and less, you lose the dupondius eventually as well. So by the time you get to the 3rd century, you have a sestertius, the denarius, which is the small silver coin, although by this point the denarius really has only about 75% silver. And what they did at the beginning of the 3rd century was introduce a new coin. We don't actually know what they called it. We call it an antoninianus. But it was worth 2 denarii, but it only had as much silver in it as a regular denarius. So the government is making 50% profit on that. And then, of course, the aureus as well. But in that, they actually reduced the size of it. And throughout the 3rd century, what happened was that the Roman government put less and less silver in that antoninianus. So you start off with something nice and shiny like this, which is the denarius. It's almost, this particular specimen is almost 100% silver. You go to the antoninianus. This is from the time of Caracalla. It's kind of gray. It's only 50% silver. You go to something like this. Remember, the antoninianus was worth 2 denarii. This coin has almost no silver in it at all, and it's worth 5 denarii. And by this point, this is the end of the 3rd century, the beginning of the 4th century, there are no denarius coins anymore. All those coins we talked about have all disappeared. So all you have are multiples. And again, if you think about some small countries, and certainly before the euro came in, if you ever traveled to Italy or Greece or whatever, then eventually you get a coin like this, which is worth 25 denarii. And eventually you end up, this is sort of the middle of the 4th century. Unfortunately, I don't have one here, but a coin that's about a third, perhaps, the size of this. And it's actually called a myriad. That is, it's worth 10,000 denarii. And so basically you have piles and piles and piles of these little tiny copper coins worth 10,000 denarii each, a little bit of silver, and lots of gold. And consequently, most ordinary people have almost no real use for coins at all. They just have the small bronze things, and so people tend to have to barter.
So a good way for a student to think about it would be, for example, when I was a kid, a penny could actually purchase you something, you know, candy or whatever. Yeah, you get candy out of it. But over time, the purchasing value of a penny eroded. So that's why we don't circulate them anymore. And the same thing happened in ancient Rome. As the buying power of the lower denomination coins sort of wore away, they changed the way the coinage was allocated in order to make it work as a purchasing unit, which is a really neat way for a student to see it.
Yeah, you can think about it simply in terms of ATMs. When ATMs first came out, you got $10 bills and $20 bills. Then all you got were $20 bills. Yeah. Now you notice you're starting to get $50 bills out of the machines. Eventually, that's all you're going to get is $50 bills. And that's essentially the same thing that happened with Roman coinage as well, except the problem is that in the 3rd and the 4th century, there was rampant inflation as the government reduce the amount of valuable metals in the currency, and so you end up with a little teeny weeny coin smaller than a dime that's worth 10,000 denarii. But in terms of purchasing power of gold, the prices in the 5th century are virtually the same as prices in the 1st century, and that's because for the rich, there really is no inflation because they're still dealing with the pure gold coinage.
Right.
Everybody else who has to deal with the watered down bronze coinage, they're the ones who get hit with the inflation.
Yeah, and your statement about the money being worth what the government says it's worth is also something that's really helpful for students because apart from collectible coins, most coins around the world today don't get their value from the metal that's in them, but from the denomination they're assigned. So,
well, that was one of the reasons why they got rid of the penny, because the metal in it was actually worth more than the penny itself.
Yeah.
And that's what happened in the 3rd century. People looked at the coinage and said, look, there's only 50% silver in this coin. You say it's worth 2 denarii, well, we know it's only worth 1. So what happens from the 3rd century on is that the coinage is treated basically as bullion. Whatever the metal is worth, that's what the coin is worth.